Chapter 9, Attracting and Retaining the Best Employees. And it's interesting that we have several chapters on this, but if you stop to think about it, wow, hiring a bad egg can be really expensive. And in fact, HR experts estimate that it can cost up to 2 times their annual salary if you make a bad hiring decision. And that makes sense if you think about all the time selected in finding somebody, getting them up to speed, onboarding them. It's really, really expensive. So human resources is important, and it can be broken down into 3 primary activities. Those are acquiring, maintaining, and developing employees. So let's break these down a little bit further. Acquiring can be broken down into a series of steps, and let's examine those a bit more. And then maintaining can be broken down into 3 primary steps, and then lastly developing as well. So let's look at these a little bit more closely, starting with acquiring, and specifically starting with planning. So the very first step would be ascertaining what the HR needs are. And oftentimes to do this, they will do a forecast, looking at who might be retiring in the near future, to ascertain kind of what the future needs are of the institution or the organization. So a replacement chart is useful here, and a skills inventory to see if perhaps there's somebody within the organization that could fill a slot that's opening up. Sometimes, as you're probably aware, since we're not too far out of the recent recession, supply and demand don't match up. And in fact, at LBCC, this happened during the recession. And so the institution did utilize a couple of the options for workforce reduction that are listed on the slide in front of you. Specifically, we did have layoffs. They tried not to have too many. They tried to shrink through attrition. Attrition, as you may be aware, is just natural shrinkage. People leave for a variety of reasons. Their spouse may be transferred to another state. They may just want to take time off to have more time with their family, whatever the case may be. Early retirement was encouraged. There were, what you might term buyouts in the sense of, like a golden handshake. To the best of my knowledge, there were not firings, but let's differentiate between layoffs and firings. A layoff is when supply and demand don't match, and a firing, and this actually might be a good time for a firing, is if supply and demand don't match, is when the employee is not performing up to snuff. As you're probably aware, one of the biggest issues in recent years in HR is that of diversity. So what is diversity? When you ask students that, usually they'll say, well, it's having a varied workforce in terms of, I don't know, race, religion, gender. But if you think about it more deeply, for sure, those elements constitute diversity. But what about disability? So the argument in favor of diversity is that if you think exactly the same way I do, then what value are you offering me in problem solving? In fact, a diverse workforce can bring a number of different perspectives to bear. And especially in LA County, my gosh, if you think about the client base that a lot of institutions are serving, it makes sense to have a diverse workforce in order to to be able to relate to those different client bases. So this is a prospective ad for an employee. And we'll come back to this ad. I have another question for you. But first I want to ask you, is this a job description or a job specification? So if you've read the chapter, then hopefully you know the answer. So a job description talks about what the person would be doing day to day. Job specification talks about the candidate. What skills and attributes do they have? So looking back, I hope you said that it is a job specification. But let's come back to that job specification. I have a little bit more I want to say about it. One of the quandaries that HR, well, not so much HR, but other managers face is, should we hire from within or not? Or should we bring in fresh blood? And there are 2 perspectives on that. If you're hiring from within, it can incentivize current employees. There's a clear path for them kind of up. And above and beyond that, I would say they already know the culture. so they know what to expect. You've already seen them, they're a known entity. The downside, however, is you may want to bring in a fresh perspective. You may want a new way of doing things. And then obviously the person that you moved up or laterally, you need to replace that slot as well. So there's pros and cons. Okay. In terms of the selection process, in years past, I used to ask, why would you need an application? But I think everybody's kind of clued into that now, that an application is fairly standard, because it allows you to compare prospective employees, kind of apples to apples, and make it a little bit more objective rather than just saying, oh, I really hit it off with Todd. And it's also nice to have everything in writing, heaven forbid the prospect does lie to you, but sometimes they do. It's better to have that in writing in case you do need to make some adjustments. Okay, so these are various techniques that are available. More and more companies, however, are turning to big data. And let me come back to that when we talk about legal issues. So the orientation is kind of the onboarding process. One of the key decisions is how much compensation and what form that compensation should take. So I want to ask you, how do you figure out, what is let's say you haven't hired an electrical engineer in the past 5 years. How do you as an HR professional find out what that person should be paid? Well, I'm going to put a link up for you to a useful website called Glassdoor, and I hope you poke around on that. You may find it useful even for yourself. Okay, so the idea of comparable worth is that comparable jobs should be paid roughly the same. And this is to address the issue of, in years past, a man could be an administrative assistant, but a woman was a secretary. And guess which one made less? A lot less. And so comparable worth argues, you know what? They're doing really the same thing, so they ought to be paid roughly the same. So I'll let you take a look at the exercise. And you know what? This is actually a good opportunity for you to look at the Glassdoor site and see if you could answer that. Compensation can take many, many different forms. As you probably know, it's not just salary anymore, but what kind of, are you putting away for if it's a highly compensated employee, are you putting away for their retirement? We know what kind of medical, dental, eye care are you offering, etc. Is there profit sharing? Is there an ESOP, an employee stock ownership option? Okay, so here's some on employee benefits. And the trend is I'm sorry for jumping, the trend is to make it a bit more flexible because families come in so many different forms now. So the employee can kind of pick and choose what they need. All right, let's look at training. Here's another area that's really undergone a sea change. I remember in years past, employers sending me, case in point, one sent me to Colorado for a couple days to learn about programmable parts, and it was really expensive for them to do that. If you think about airfare, if you think about my hotel, and then even think about the per diem, them having to pay for my food and things, and then of course the cost of the conference. Wow, it was really, really expensive. Well, I'm going to put up a link that shows you kind of the current trend. It's amazing what you can do in terms of online training now, and not surprisingly, that's gotten really popular. So let me put up the Movo site. And that falls under e-learning, and it's useful, not only because the employee, it's less expensive, right, because of all the costs I just mentioned, but the employee can go at their own pace, and they can do it in little nuggets. It doesn't have to be so much, crammed into an extended period of time, but they can kind of break it up. So here's an exercise you may want to think about. Is if you are an HR manager for a luxury hotel, you're responsible for training and development for the hotel employees. You need to create training programs tailored to the needs of various departments. How would you go about doing that? All right, so moving on, assuming that you have brought someone on board, you have trained them, they're doing some work. Now it makes sense that you would want to appraise their performance. And the really fascinating thing is, LBCC has finally caught up with the rest of the world in terms of doing what are called 360-degree performance appraisals. These have been around for a while. They're not terribly new. You have probably had a performance appraisal at work where your direct supervisor evaluates your performance and gives you some feedback. What you may not have done is had the chance to evaluate that supervisor. That's part of what a 360-degree review is 360 degrees means all the way around. So it's folks all the way around you, even next to you and below you, giving some feedback. Now, needless to say, it takes a little different form than the performance appraisal that you've probably had in the past because you have to make it anonymous. So the interesting thing is, I did an evaluation on a colleague in a sister area to us, and they, whoever had sent the link for the 360, sent back a link on performance appraisals. Performance appraisals errors. And so this isn't the link that they sent me, but I'm going to put up a link on a very interesting video on performance appraisal errors, which I think you'll find really, really useful, especially if you do find yourself as a supervisor evaluating people, because it is easy to be swayed by what the employee has done just recently, be it positive or negative, how well you get along with them, how similar they are to you, and a number of things that really should not impact the performance appraisal. So I think you'll find that really interesting. Okay, so a bit on evaluation techniques, and I'm not going to drill down too far into this because the HR class, HR management, covers this in greater detail. Okay, the legal environment of HR is just fascinating right now. So let me stop at this point because I have so much to say on that. I think I'm going to make that the subject of part 2.